The day I found out my neighbors had sold my family's private road without asking me, I didn't scream, I didn't call the police, and I didn't run outside with a camera like most people probably would have. I just stood there in my driveway, looking at the orange survey flag stuck into the gravel, and I remember thinking one thing: they have absolutely no idea what they just started. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I live on 4 acres of wooded land tucked away in the mountains outside Boone, North Carolina, a place where mornings still smell like wet pine trees and old wooden fences, where the loudest sound most days is usually a bird hitting the roof or my old truck starting up after sitting overnight. This land wasn't something I bought because it looked good in a real estate listing. It was something my family built piece by piece, generation after generation. My grandfather purchased the property back in 1947 when there was barely a road leading into the area, just a rough dirt trail through the trees that he and my uncle slowly cleared by hand. That little road became known as Cedar Hollow Road, and for decades it was the only way my family reached our home. I grew up hearing stories about that road, about my grandfather hauling lumber down it, about my father driving his first truck across that gravel when he was 16, about family gatherings where everyone parked along the same stretch of dirt under the old cedar trees. It wasn't just a path, it was part of who we were. Then, years later, a neighborhood development appeared around us. In 2009, a large subdivision called Ridgeview Estates was built nearby, and eventually the homeowners association started managing the community. At first, I had no problem with them. Honestly, I barely noticed them. I kept to myself, maintained my property, paid my taxes, and lived my quiet life. But over time, things changed. The HOA board started acting less like neighbors and more like they owned the entire mountain. They complained about small things, sent letters about appearances, and slowly developed this attitude that if something was near their community, it somehow belonged to them. I ignored most of it because I wasn't interested in fighting over every little disagreement. Life is too short for that. But then one humid morning in late July, everything changed. I was drinking coffee on my back porch when I heard something I hadn't heard in years. Heavy machinery. Not a lawnmower. Not a delivery truck, with the deep grinding sound of diesel engines coming through the trees. At first, I thought maybe the county was doing road maintenance. But when I walked towards Cedar Hollow Road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were workers everywhere, survey equipment, orange markers, fresh gravel piles. And right in the middle of my family's road were small metal stakes with labels that read Ridgeview Estates Axe Expansion. I just stood there for a minute trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. I walked up to one of the workers and asked, "Hey, can I ask what exactly you're doing out here?" The man looked uncomfortable, glanced at his paperwork, and said, "I'm sorry, sir. You'd have to talk to the HOA. We were told this was approved property." Approved property. Those words stayed in my head all day, because I knew something they apparently didn't. Nobody had ever sold that road. Nobody had ever transferred ownership. Nobody had ever asked me for permission. A week later, I found the letter waiting in my mailbox. It was sitting there like some official announcement from a company that had just bought a building, not a piece of land that had belonged to my family for nearly 80 years. The letter had the HOA logo at the top, a fancy gold emblem, and a signature from the HOA president, Victoria Langley. It said that Cedar Hollow Road had been officially transferred to Ridgeview Estates for community improvement purposes. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes people do something so unbelievably confident and wrong that your brain doesn't know how else to react. Victoria lived in the biggest house at the end of the subdivision, a massive stone home with perfect landscaping, and a driveway that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She'd always carried herself like she was the mayor of a city instead of the president of a neighborhood association, and now she had decided my family's road was hers too. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out the old documents my grandfather left behind. The original deed, the property maps, the handwritten notes, everything my family had carefully preserved. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, Under the yellow light above my table, I found the first crack in Victoria's perfect little plan. I spent the next 2 nights doing something I probably should have done years earlier. I stopped assuming people would respect what was right and started proving what was right. I opened every county record I could find, pulled old property maps, searched through archived documents, and slowly started putting together the story of what had really happened. The funny thing about paperwork is that most people think it's boring until the day it becomes the only thing standing between them and losing something they love. Then suddenly every faded stamp, every handwritten note, and every line of legal language becomes worth more than gold. I logged into the county property system, downloaded the original plats, looked through recorded easements, and compared every boundary line against the new documents the HOA was using. At first, I thought maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe someone filed the wrong paperwork. Maybe there was some misunderstanding between the HOA and the county. I wanted to believe that because it was easier than accepting the alternative, that someone had intentionally pushed forward with a plan they knew wasn't right. But around midnight on the second night, I found it. Buried inside the original deed from 1947 was a section most people would have skipped over without thinking twice. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't written in a way that grabbed your attention. It was just a paragraph sitting quietly in an old document. But that paragraph changed everything. The deed clearly stated that Cedar Hollow Road remained private family property and that no transfer, sale, or ownership change could happen without written approval from the title holder. And that title holder was me. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a few minutes. I wasn't excited. I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, I was disappointed. Because this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about realizing someone had looked at something my family protected for generations and decided they could simply take it because they had enough people on a board vote. But then I noticed something else, something that made the whole situation even more interesting. The HOA wasn't just using the road. They were depending on my land for something much more important. Their president, Victoria Langley, had built her beautiful home at the edge of Ridgeview Estates, and years earlier, the previous owner had received permission to run a small water line underneath Cedar Hollow Road. It was a simple arrangement, a private utility easement that allowed water access across my property, but it was based on permission from the landowner. My permission, the same permission that could be revoked if the conditions were violated. I read that sentence over and over, and suddenly, the picture became much clearer. Victoria thought she was taking ownership of my road. She didn't realize the very thing keeping water flowing to her house depended on the same paperwork she had ignored. The next morning, I drove over to Ridgeview Estates. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wanted to hear it directly from her. I wanted to know if she actually believed what she was doing was acceptable or if she had just convinced herself that nobody would challenge her. Victoria opened the door wearing a perfectly pressed white shirt, holding a coffee cup in one hand, looking exactly like someone who had already decided they were the smartest person in the room. "Daniel," she said, almost surprised to see me. "Is there something I can help you with?" I handed her a copy of the deed. She barely looked at it. "We already handled the transfer," she said. "The HOA approved it, and the county has the paperwork." I looked at her and said, "The HOA can vote on your landscaping rules and your community meetings. They can't vote themselves into owning somebody else's property." Her expression changed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "You misunderstanding how progress works," she said. "This community is growing. We're improving access for everyone." I almost laughed because that was the part that bothered me most. People always use words like progress when they want to make something sound better than it is. They weren't improving something they owned. They were expanding into something that wasn't theirs. "Victoria," I said, "you didn't improve my road. You transferred something you never had the authority to transfer." She crossed her arms and gave me a small smile. "It's already filed, Daniel. You can't stop progress." That sentence probably would have upset me a month earlier, but standing there, holding the documents my grandfather left behind, I realized something. She wasn't confident because she was right. She was confident because nobody had challenged her before. So I smiled back and said, I don't need to stop progress. I just need to withdraw permission. For the first time during our conversation, she looked confused. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't have to. I could see she knew there was something she had missed. I left her house, drove straight to the county clerk's office, and spent the afternoon confirming every detail. The clerk reviewed the deed, checked the easement records, and finally looked at me and said, "Mr. Mercer, based on these documents, you do have the authority to revoke that access agreement if the conditions were violated." That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't fighting with an HOA anymore. I was protecting my property through the exact system they thought gave them power. I had the revocation paperwork prepared, signed it in front of a notary, and filed it officially. Then I contacted the water district and provided the recorded documents. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't make a public scene. I simply followed the same rules they claimed to care about. And 2 days later, a service truck pulled up near Victoria's house. I still remember the morning the water finally stopped running at Victoria Langley's house, because what surprised me most wasn't the silence coming from her sprinklers or the fact her perfectly planned little world had suddenly hit a wall. What surprised me was how quickly people started paying attention once the consequences reached someone powerful. For weeks, I had been trying to tell everyone the same thing, that this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making someone's life miserable. And it definitely wasn't about a road. It was about one simple question. Who gets to decide what belongs to them? But people usually don't ask that question until the answer affects their own front door. When the water district truck left Victoria's property that afternoon, I watched from a distance. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like some hero who had defeated the enemy. Honestly, I felt tired, because the entire situation had started with something so unnecessary. A conversation could have prevented everything. A phone call could have prevented everything. Someone from the HOA could have simply walked over, knocked on my door, and said, "Daniel, we're looking at changes to Cedar Hollow Road. Can we talk?" And maybe we would have found a solution. Maybe there would have been an agreement. Maybe nobody would have ended up embarrassed. But instead, they chose paperwork over respect, authority over conversation, and assumptions over facts. And that was the part that bothered me the most. A few days after the water was shut off, Victoria requested a meeting with me. She didn't come with the same confidence she had the first time we spoke. The attitude was different. The smile was gone. She looked less like someone running a community and more like someone trying to understand how a plan that seemed impossible to fail had fallen apart. We met at a small coffee shop near town, away from the neighborhood drama. She sat across from me, placed her hands around her coffee cup, and for the first time since I had known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain. "Daniel," she said, "I want you to understand something. We weren't trying to steal your property." I nodded because maybe she believed that. Maybe in her mind, she wasn't stealing anything. Maybe she had convinced herself that because the HOA represented hundreds of homeowners, whatever they wanted was automatically reasonable. But good intentions don't erase consequences. "Victoria," I said, "I believe you thought you were doing something good for the neighborhood, but that doesn't mean you had the right to do it." She looked down at the table for a moment. "We thought the road was part of the community." And there it was, the sentence that explained everything. They thought, they assumed, they believed. But property ownership doesn't work that way. A boundary line doesn't disappear because enough people forget it exists. An old deed doesn't become meaningless because a newer neighborhood grows around it. The truth doesn't change just because nobody bothered to check. Over the next month, Ridgeview Estates went through a major shakeup. Homeowners started demanding answers from the HOA board. They wanted to know why thousands of dollars had already been spent planning improvements on a road the HOA didn't own. They wanted to know why the board never contacted me before making decisions that affected my property. Some residents apologized to me. Some admitted they had never even realized Cedar Hollow Road was private land. Others stayed angry and believed I should have handled everything differently. And honestly, I expected that. Whenever there's a conflict like this, people want a simple answer. They want one person to be completely right and the other person to be completely wrong. But real life is rarely that clean. I wasn't angry at the entire neighborhood. Most of those people had nothing to do with the decision. They bought homes there because they trusted the people managing the community. They believed the information they were given. The problem wasn't the residents. The problem was that a small group of people with authority stopped remembering that authority comes with responsibility. Eventually, the road transfer was officially reversed. The HOA had to cover legal expenses, undo the changes they had started, and pay restoration costs connected to the failed project. Victoria stepped down from her position shortly afterward. Some people expected me to celebrate that. They expected me to say I had won. But that's not really how I saw it. Nobody wins when neighbors stop trusting each other. Nobody wins when a quiet community turns into a battlefield. The only thing I felt was relief that the truth had finally caught up with the situation. Months later, I found myself walking along Cedar Hollow Road one evening as the sun was dropping behind the trees. It was the same road I had walked hundreds of times as a kid. The same gravel under my boots. The same old cedar trees standing beside the path. And I started thinking about how strange life can be. Sometimes the things we fight hardest to protect are the things other people don't even notice. To someone driving through the neighborhood, it was just a dirt road. To me, it was where my grandfather taught me how to drive. It was where my father carried supplies when he built our family home. It was where generations of my family came together. It carried memories that couldn't be replaced with money or paperwork. And maybe that's why this whole thing became bigger than a property dispute. It became a reminder that ownership isn't just about having a document in a drawer. It's about responsibility. It's about respecting the history behind something before deciding you have the right to change it. I still drive that road every morning. I still see the same trees, the same hills, the same quiet landscape my family loved for decades. But now, every time I pass through, I remember something important. Sometimes people don't understand your boundaries until you enforce them. Sometimes they don't respect what you have until they realize you're willing to protect it. And maybe people will disagree with how I handled everything. Maybe some will say shutting off the water was too extreme. Maybe others will say I did exactly what anyone should do when their rights are ignored. I'm curious what you think. If your neighbors try to sell something that belonged to your family without your permission, would you fight back through every legal option available? Or would you try to find another way before things escalated? Was this a case of standing up for yourself? Or did the punishment go too far? I want to hear your opinion, because these stories are never just about land. They're about trust, fairness, power, and the moment when an ordinary person has to decide whether to stay quiet or finally stand their ground. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts below. Share this video with someone who has ever dealt with a difficult neighborhood situation, and subscribe for more real lifestyle stories where everyday people discover that sometimes the strongest thing they can do is simply refuse to be pushed aside.